So I think we're going to get started. Firstly, I just want to say thank you all so much for taking the time out of your evenings, away from your families, away from work, to have what is promised to be, one of a series of fairly uncomfortable conversations for a lot of us to have. I'll say I looked at the registration and I saw the names on here, and this is just such a great group of people who are extremely influential, extremely resourceful, and have a lot to add to this movement in this moment. As I mentioned, that these conversations can be really uncomfortable. That's some feedback that I've been getting from a lot of people I've been talking with. And what I'll say is this: listen, as a reminder, what we talk about when we talk about race is so big and so close to each of us that it's nearly impossible to take it all in, let alone fully understand it well enough to feel like you have the right to engage in it. And so what I would say is, the more you engage, the more you learn, the easier it's going to be for you to be able to pull all this into perspective and to engage in it and actually make some change. And so the purpose of these talks is to bring to this very talented, very influential group of people some valuable perspectives and insights that we as a country and as members of a global community are facing regarding race. Each of you will hopefully, my hope is that each of you will be better informed, more fired up, and better equipped to make and to be the changes in the institutions and the cultures that we all know and are a part of. So tonight, we're going to be focusing on the topics of justice, peace, and reconciliation. These are all concepts that I would say are central to what we are seeing and reading about every day. And my hope is that you all will be inspired to move on and continue some critical dialogue around these topics, and to take some direct action within your communities. And this is certainly the best time to do it. And the fact that so many really talented, hardworking people with families are on right now, I feel like this is it. And so please, listen up, ask any questions that you would have, because it's important to me that you all walk out of here with something, something that's going to help you move this movement forward. So tonight, I've asked Tim Ingrassia, our iconic 30-plus year investment banking veteran and racial equity ally and Goldman Sachs partner, to help guide this conversation with Baz Dresinger, a global leader in justice and an activist and a professor and just an awesome dear friend of mine who has made more change than in her lifetime with the work that she's done and is doing than almost anybody I can think of. And so I just want to say one more thing. As mentioned in my email, after this discussion, what I'll do is I'll spend some time, I'll keep the session open to talk about the recommendations that I discussed in the last topic, Black in America, about what I believe financial institutions and corporate America generally can and should be doing to meet this moment. And so if anyone is interested, we can spend some more time after this discussion. And just as a housekeeping matter, I just point everybody to the chat box where Peter Koch, a fellow justice worker at GOSO, has put some really important messages in there regarding how to ask questions, when to ask questions, and so on. So I just ask everyone to take a look there. And with that, I want to bring Tim and Baz into the picture.
Thanks, Reg. And let me take just one quick moment specifically to thank you at a moment of almost unimaginable unrest, and I hope at a moment of hope and change. The time that you have taken to educate, to enlighten, and to encourage participation by a broad group of people is really appreciated. And obviously what you've done at at GOSO. For those on the line who aren't familiar with GOSO, Get Out, Stay Out is a program that Reg is the chairman of, and plays just a vital role in that rehabilitation and reintroduction of formerly incarcerated people. So thank you for that. You know, my background is certainly as an investment banker, but also as a resident of Brooklyn, and having been involved in a number of organizations in Brooklyn, including serving on the board of the Brooklyn Public Library, where in the last 18 months, we launched an initiative with Bard College, their Bard Prison Initiative, which was really patterned after a lot of what Dr. Baz Dresinger really invented with John Jay. And so it's been a particular thrill, Baz, to have the opportunity to study your work and to spend some time talking to you. Why don't we jump into today's dialogue? For the group that isn't as familiar with you, it strikes me that there are three really distinct legs of your work. You're an author. You wrote Incarceration Nation, which was a study of prison systems around the world. You're an innovator and a teacher who got very involved in the prison to college pipeline and teaching and being a part of the development of that program. And you're a scholar. You're one of the experts in the world on truth and reconciliation commissions. That's an awful lot. How did you get there? How did this become the focus? How do they feed off of one another?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Tim, for that introduction. Thank you, Reg, for putting this together and tirelessly and diligently coordinating all of this. I'm excited to have this conversation with you guys and to connect and build and reason. So yeah, I wear a lot of hats. I like how you summed them up and put them together. I write, I'm an activist. I call myself on social media an agitator because I sort of think that's really what brings it all together under one umbrella, which is this idea of being an agitator to the status quo and really consistently using radical imagination to rethink our assumptions about how we do things, why we do things, what makes sense, what is fair, what justice means. And I think that kind of undergirds everything that I do. And I'm also consistently trying to think and do at the same time, which is not always easy because to do requires a level of engagement with the world and kind of constantly being on the front lines and seeing things and witnessing things and bearing witness is really, really important when it comes to prison work. But then being a writer and a researcher and a scholar means stepping back and having time to reflect on it and think about it and how it all sort of comes together. So I think I'm consistently juggling these, but all in the name of pushing the envelope in terms of how we think about justice and how we do justice and how we consistently do justice better, which is what we need to always be doing.
So I want to unpack each of them a little bit. If you're comfortable, maybe we could start with Incarceration Nation. Can you describe some of the work that went into that and maybe some of the learnings when you look at prisons in many countries? What does it teach you? What should it teach us about prisons in this country?
So with Incarceration Nations, I wanted to spotlight global prison systems, period, as opposed to just focusing on the US system. And I also wanted to explore the US system's impact on the world. And I think one of the big, great points of education, even for me in researching the book, was how detrimental the US has been, not only in building our own prison system, but in cut and pasting it on the world. And so in essence, without getting into too much of the history and specifics, you can read my book for that, but I do talk about how the US, first through colonialism and then through globalization, created this system that we know as the modern prison system as the exclusive response to to harm in communities, and then foisted it on the world and continues to push aspects of our punitive model of justice, including solitary confinement, including prison privatization, prison architecture, all of these things on the world. So I wanted to think about the US in relationship to the world. And I also wanted to just, as I said before, think and rethink why we use incarceration as a response to harm. Why do we do that? And why does it kind of ultimately, as I argue, not make sense anywhere? Why is it, as I see it, an experiment that's had its time, a really vicious, racist, and imperialist experiment that's had its time? So the larger takeaway is, I think, that we need to stop responding to harm. And I say harm and not crime very deliberately, because crime is a social construction. Harm is a moral, philosophical reality, right? So crime is constructed by societies. But when we talk about harm, we're talking about fundamental, a fundamental truth in a sense. So I wanted to rethink why we do this way. And I wanted to look at examples from around the world of maybe thinking about it a different way. And sometimes we don't understand our own systems until we step outside the context of them and step outside the national context of them, as happens to all of us when we travel, right? We're stepping outside of those boundaries. And so I learned lessons from Rwanda. I learned lessons from Norway. I learned lessons from Singapore, from Thailand. I mean, from places where you might not say the overall system of justice is wonderfully innovative and progressive, but there are things that we can take away and learn from and use to interrogate our own system of justice.
What's the reaction been to the work, and is there a dialogue right now to change that prison pipeline and that prison system?
So I think we're seeing, and I know we're going to get into all kinds of issues in this already too short conversation because it's so much to talk about. But I think we are seeing in this moment a radical questioning on a new level of not only police structures, but also our whole criminal legal system and our whole vision of justice and what that means and how it's targeted certain communities. So I definitely think there is more openness to ideas about alternative systems, and I don't even like alternative because that implies, prison must be at the center and then we can have some little experiments on the side, but really whole different paradigms for exploring what justice can mean. And I also think right now is a moment where we are looking at the world more than ever before. And I say we as Americans, we tend to be very, insular in our approaches to things in this country, but we're suddenly looking around at COVID rates all around the world and saying, hey, why is this working over there? And I don't think it's an accident. And again, it's a part of a bigger conversation, but I don't think it's an accident that the countries with the highest COVID rates are also the most unequal countries, also the most often crime-ridden countries with incredibly high incarceration rates. And I'm thinking, of course, about the US, but I'm thinking about the leader in Latin America, Brazil. I'm thinking about the leader in Africa, South Africa. So we're seeing a correlation between lack of systems and structures that are just and equitable and an attachment to mass incarceration that's an outgrowth of that, alongside the COVID rates and deaths and all of the trauma that we're seeing unleashed worldwide. So it's definitely a moment to have this conversation and to have it globally.
I'm struck as you make that statement, the phrase American exceptionalism comes to mind, which for many people has meant the exception is that we're better at everything, and it's pretty clear that we're not. Yeah.
I mean, well, we're really good at incarcerating. We're the world's #1 incarcerator. As we're leading in, our COVID rates, we've been leading in incarceration. We have 5% of the world's population, 25% of its prison population. Our sentences are longer than anyone else in the world. Our death penalty, we are one of few countries to have life imprisonment and death penalties. I mean, we are grounded in a culture that is punitive, that is harmful, on a level that transcends anyone else in the world. And I have been in countries all over where I have been approached, and people will come to say, I can't believe that in your country people can't vote when they come out of prison in multiple, dozens of states. I can't believe that you give people life. Life in other countries doesn't mean literally life. It means a certain number of high years after which things are reconsidered. So we are very much exceptional in this culture of punitivity and culture of the social control that it produces as well.
One of the phrases that jumped out at me as I read articles about you and about what you've done is this phrase restorative justice, and this transition from punitive justice to restorative justice. And there was something hopeful about that word restorative justice. Tell me what it means to you, and maybe that can bridge us to some of your work with incarcerated people as well.
So I think that's definitely a term that we're seeing around a lot more now, that I feel really excited about and hopeful about, that it's become much more part of the lexicon than it was even a few months ago. And restorative justice, I write about it, I focus on it heavily in my book, in the chapters about Rwanda post-genocide and South Africa post-apartheid, two countries that I think took restorative justice and made it most famous in various respects, to varying degrees of success, which we can talk about. But ultimately, restorative justice is a different paradigm. It's the kind of opposite of punitive justice. So when we talk about punitive justice, we're saying, okay, a harm has been committed. So who did it? How do we punish them? That's what our justice system as it stands right now does. But when we talk about restorative justice, we say, okay, instead of focusing on who did it and how we then we punish them, and ultimately how we respond to harm with harm, right? We take someone who's caused harm and we say, I'm going to teach you to not cause harm by doing harm to you, whether that's a death penalty or a sentence in prison, right? It's a fundamentally hypocritical act. Instead, a restorative justice paradigm says, I'm going to say who was harmed and what are their needs and how do we address them? And how does the person who did the harming engage in the act of repairing the harm? So restorative justice it's not like one particular toolkit or one particular model. There's lots of ways to do it, but it's grounded in the idea that you can take the person who has experienced the harm, center them in the criminal justice system and in what justice looks like. The person who has experienced the harm, rather, the survivor, should be at the centerpiece of this. And then we say, what are their needs and how can we bring the person who caused that harm into the mix to address them, whether it's through apology, whether it's through acts of reparation, whether it's through serving the community at large in some greater respect. But ultimately, it doesn't assume that what is going to bring the person, the survivor or the victim, as we say, what is going to bring that person the healing that that person deserves, it doesn't assume that that's prison and punishment. Because ultimately, and again, there's so much to say about this, and it's a very, there's a lot of literature and it's a very complex process that I'm trying to simplify. But ultimately, what studies show us time and again is that punishment doesn't give us the healing that we so desire when we are harmed. That harming someone else doesn't do that.
It feels in some ways a system that at least believes that act of punishment isn't about the individual who's being punished. It's a warning to others that fear of punishment should prevent others from acting. Are there learnings about that in other words, which is the system trying to address, the next act or the last act?
Definitely, and that's a great way of putting it, because ultimately we know what you're talking about is this idea of deterrence, which some people take for granted when they talk about incarceration, right? We punish people because it's a deterrent to others. But study after study has shown us that deterrence is not real, that when we talk about people who are committing crimes, that it's not psychologically going to jump into their mind in that moment. Oops, I better not do this because I might go to prison. That no amount of instilling fear in people is going to bring us the just society that we all desire and is going to build safety. I mean, if deterrence worked, we'd be the safest country in the world, right, with 2.3 million people incarcerated. And that's just on a sort of no-brainer logic approach. But there are lots of studies that show us that that is not the case. And in fact, I like the way that you put it in terms of past and future, because in essence, restorative justice is future-looking, whereas punitive justice is stuck in the past. It's stuck in saying, you did this, you did this, you did this, and we will keep reiterating that and harming you for that for the rest of your life. Whereas restorative justice is a way of looking forward and saying, what will truly ensure that you don't do this again? What will truly ensure that for the person who has experienced the harm, the future looks like a future that involves healing and restoration, as opposed to, you know, the old model of things.
Let's use that to move from the macro for a moment of prison systems to the micro of incarcerated people and their experience and their reformative path. Tell me about what you've done in prisons and with the college programs that you've been a part of.
So my entry point really in terms of, you know, working inside prisons is through education. And so I see everything. I mean, I'm an educator first and foremost. And so I kind of see everything through the lens of education. So I definitely see prisons heavily through a lens of, you know, the hashtag of education, not incarceration. And I began working in prisons almost 2 decades ago as a volunteer through education. I was doing a lot of journalism pieces that connected kind of race and culture and crime and pop culture and music. And I was getting a lot of letters from people in prison, and an educational group in a maximum security prison in New York invited me to be a guest speaker. And I went in, and I had been in a prison visiting room before. I had been in a setting inside a prison, but never in a room full of hundreds of incarcerated people as, you know, as the guest speaker. And my mind was blown at the level of commitment and intellect and talent and meticulous brilliance in the room. And I walked out of there feeling this enormous sense of sadness, not just for, and actually not even primarily for the incarcerated people I'd encountered, but for us as a society, that we were being denied that brilliance because we had warehoused away this level of brilliance in our society. And so I became committed to, at that time, I had recently started as a professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And throughout the CUNY system, there wasn't any college program. There weren't many in New York State. There was the BARD program. There were a couple others around the country, but again, just summarizing quickly, there used to be hundreds of college programs prior to the 1994 crime bill signed by then President Clinton. And among the many things that were a product of that bill were a decimation of college programs in prisons around the country. And it was a very punitive bill, of course. So there was this sense that they don't deserve education.
I had no idea.
Yeah, so the 94 Krill was an omnibus bill. So there were a lot of pieces to that puzzle. And one of them was around decimating financial aid for incarcerated students. So it didn't explicitly say we ban college, but it decimated the funding for it. So in the span of a year, you went from about 350 programs to 8. And this was all in the mid-90s.
Wow.
And that slowly got built up again, but it meant you had to come up with funding for building these. So when BARD built its program, had to get funding. Hudson Link was one in New York. So anyway, fast forward to 2010, which is about when I started the conversations, 2009, 2010, there weren't many programs. And I said, we really need, as CUNY, as the public university, you know, the largest urban public university in the world, we need to be educating everyone, and that includes incarcerated students. And so I ultimately, with colleagues at John Jay, I started the Prison to College Pipeline Program. And the essence of it is, you know, we've been talking about pipelines. It was to reverse what we know as the school to prison pipeline. And that is the way that our school systems in the US, also in many other countries, I've seen the same thing, by virtue of criminalizing, especially Black and brown youth in really dysfunctional, over-policed school systems all over the country, we essentially funnel people from school directly into prison. And so what I wanted to do was reverse that flow and say, we're going to funnel people from prison into college. So we not only offered and continue to offer college programs while people are in prison, sending professors, and I taught in the program in all of its decade of existence, teaching English in the prisons. I'm technically an English professor. I forget that myself sometimes. But the other idea was that we wanted to also focus on reentry, which was starting to become a real buzzword at the time, back in 2009, 2010. And so I said, we're going to guarantee our students a place in college when they come home. And in the whether that's the CUNY system or Harvard, we'll work with them. And we'll work with them on other aspects of reentry, and that is a lot. So that's housing and jobs and trauma-informed services and all kinds of things that are needed. And so since the program has launched, I mean, I launched it a decade ago, and we've now touched hundreds of lives, and that's not only our incarcerated and formerly incarcerated students who have continue to go on to do incredible things. Everything, you know, from starting dog assistance programs to going to law school to becoming Soros Justice Fellows to traveling around the world with me, promoting education behind bars in ways that are far better and more powerful than I could do. Our student, and that includes also our professors whose lives have been changed by teaching in this context, students that we take in from the outside who become part of classrooms alongside incarcerated peers. And it's been amazing. You know, I learned anything that I know about justice, I learned in the context of that program, in the context of my students. And that's why I dedicated my book to them. They are my teachers.
So I have to ask, because I was completely unaware of that history and the impact of the defunding in the 90s. But being a little bit familiar with the BARD program and now what Brooklyn Library is doing with BARD in the libraries themselves, one of the challenges that the Brooklyn Libraries had is the demand for the product so greatly exceeds the capacity to provide the product. Is that an issue for the John Jay program as well? How do you choose who gets to benefit from this?
It is a painful choice. I mean, we would have a whole admissions process where we actually expanded to travel throughout New York State, where we worked with the Department of Corrections to recruit students from, I think we were up to 7 different facilities, 7 different prisons, and do an interview process in all of those prisons and then have them transferred to the prison that we offer the classes in. So it became a statewide initiative in that respect. Over the years, too, it's been wonderful to watch more programs crop up around the country, around New York State. It's been wonderful to watch federal funding return on a limited basis to this. The Second Chance Pell Act, which was an Obama initiative, allowed for more sites and allowed for federal funding, not across the board, but to select programs. But I can't state enough how much of a demand there is and how little we are able to meet it. And it comes down to funding, because it's a lot of legwork to do this. It's not just about paying for tuition, because you can get tuition waivers. You really need the feet on the ground. It's an in-person act, and I say this about reentry work also. GOSO people who are on this call know this from experience. There is no substitute for human beings when it comes to doing this work, both on the inside and on the outside. So you have to pay people, and it's not cheap. Ultimately, yes, you save money. We know that educating people in the first place prevents people from being funneled into the system, number one. So if people had access to higher education in the first place, they would likely have not ended up in prison. But also we know that educating people while they're in prison is what's going to land them, not going back to prison, and also more importantly, land them living the lives that they deserve to live. In the first place, right, as citizens, as human beings. So there's so much need in this regard as far as programs.
So we've talked a little bit about the prison system and the culture in America of driving people to prisons. We've talked a little bit about incarcerated people, your work with them. I want to go backwards for a moment, and I want to get to the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions as well, but I want to go backwards for a moment because it's hard to talk about prisons without talking about policing, police systems, and of course that's such a part of the moment right now, being part of that never-ending pipeline, and this catchphrase that's so confusing to many people when they hear it, to defund the police, and it triggers for many an obvious reaction of course, because it's broken and here's why it's broken, and it triggers for others, wait a minute, if I need to dial 911, how can someone be saying that? Help us understand what it means and why now, and how it all feeds into this pipeline.
So it's critical on so many levels. One is that because we're living in this, we're in a very intense moment, and also an intense social media moment, defund the police is one half of the equation. And it's the hashtag, but the larger equation is defund the police, invest in communities. So we have to understand, and I saw this on a protest sign that was making the rounds also on social media, that the safest communities don't have the most police, they have the most resources. And so what it comes down to is, how do we build safe communities? We don't flood them with military-style policing. We flood them with access to resources, to education, to jobs, to healthcare. And so that's the overall lens in which people need to understand what defund the police and defund the prisons. I mean, at Incarceration Nation's network, we've been pushing defund the prisons to go hand in hand with that. We need to stop with this punitive approach and think about, what are we investing in? Now, it's unfortunate that invest in communities isn't as sexy a hashtag as defund the police, which I'm hearing outside my window right now. And we've heard a lot of in these times. But I think what we need to recognize is, how do we create, for lack of a better term, armies of services, armies of access to opportunities that are going into communities, as opposed to the police. What the police are doing, one statistic that shocked even me when I read it fairly recently was that 80% of them are responding to, misdemeanors. They're not going after the intense violence, and they're not even suited for that. We have to recognize too that what we train the police to do is not what we imagine they are doing. They are not peacemakers. They are not trained in social work in any capacity. No nation that I've been to around the world, with the exception of Germany and some Scandinavian countries, are training their corrections officers or police in aspects of law, social work, and so on. And so we need to think about who's doing the right job. And I equate police and corrections officers as being in the same boat here. We take people, we give them very sort of quick and easy, in some sense, training, and then we just set them loose on communities that are often not their own. And it's not even so much just a critique of them as it is a critique of our systems and structures that are not training people to do the job that we really need in communities. You mentioned 911. I have a current student, Prison to College Pipelines graduate, in fact, who's working on a coding. He's been learning coding during this quarantine. There's quite a lot of wonderful programs educating formerly incarcerated people in coding because it's a great job opportunity. And he's working on an app in connection with some other people called Not 911. And what it is it's a way of, hey, I see something happening. I see a mentally ill person. I see a homeless person about to get into some trouble on my block, but I don't want to call the cops and have that person thrown in jail to then get caught in the crosshairs of the criminal justice system and not get the help that he or she is screaming for, right? So what are my options here? How can I call someone who gives services and assistance instead of criminalization and, militarization? I think it's a brilliant idea. And I think it's so needed. But I think we should all be able to do that. That should be happening naturally. I shouldn't have to go out of my way to think about what services I call in response to things I may be seeing in my community.
So Reg promised discomfort, and I'm going to ask a question that maybe I should be careful asking, and I'll introduce it by saying that I've described myself as a white male more frequently over the last 4 months than ever in my life. And I don't know if that's good or bad. It's probably bad in a lot of ways, but I've been more aware of who I am. I've been more aware of the inadequacy of empathy relative to actual experience. And here, as a white male, I'm leading a conversation with you, a white woman, talking about issues that are of the moment right now because of the racial inequity that's existed in this country for a very long time. Is it fair for you to have a voice? Mm-hmm. Is it fair for me to be the one interviewing you? It somehow feels not wrong, but
yeah, no, that's a great question. No, it's not. And it's not fair. And we shouldn't be the ones having this conversation. We should be part of the conversation. But I can say that I think about my whiteness all the time, in that there's not a second that I do this work that I'm not aware that I'm doing it as a white person, as a woman, as an American with an American passport. Well, back in the day when the American passport was worth something and gave us access. No, but quite seriously, my work, in fact, the first word in Incarceration Nations is Mzungu, which is the Swahili word for white person. And it's what I got called a lot when the book starts in Uganda, and people would just shout at me. And in fact, I spend a lot of time, South Africa is among my other home bases, as is Trinidad and Jamaica. And those are countries where I'll walk around and be called whitey all the time. And none of which I take offense to in the slightest. That's what I am, and that's how I stick out in those contexts. But I started the book with that word because I wanted from the very outset to establish that the lens that I'm seeing this through is a lens of privilege, a lens of white privilege, a lens of American privilege, a lens of academic privilege, having the 3 letters after my name and all of that business, because I see part of my mission on this earth is to use my privilege in ways that benefit folks and benefit the world. And so if that means that it takes, unfortunately, my whiteness to amplify an issue in certain settings, whether that's in white settings in the US or in the context of, work that I'm currently doing in Ghana, where I'm being asked to moderate a panel on COVID and prisons in Ghana, because if they can have a white American, then maybe folks will pay attention. I recognize that every second that I'm doing the work. And I think the key is like, how do we harness it for the greater good? I will say that in the context, one of the things that gives me hope is that we've all been, zooming up a storm in this setting and part of all these webinars and whatnot. I've been in many of them, and I'm really happy that in a good number of them, I've been the token white person. And not like it's really powerful as a white person to then get asked to speak for all white people, and I think every white person should understand what that feels like, because you're like, I can't speak for the white community, right? I'm just doing what I do. But it's critical. And so I've been happy to see that in the context of the movement around mass incarceration, there's already been a shift such that, again, in the beginning of doing this work, there were lots of people like me, not only in terms of my whiteness, but in terms of my speaking for an issue that I am not directly impacted by or wasn't then. I didn't have family members. I'm not formally incarcerated. And now we saw a shift in that, where the movement is being led by those who are directly impacted, whose voices are, leading the way for the rest of us. And I think we're moving in a really good place. I know that I'm tuning into these conversations, and more than ever before, it's about the token, if that, as opposed to the way it used to be. So that's possible.
So let's use that as a bridge to some of your work studying truth and reconciliation commissions. A lot of the people who are dialed in may not be familiar with what they are or what they hope to represent. And increasingly we hear about a hope or a desire that something like that can become part of the canon or our national shared experience here in the United States. Touch on what they are, what you've learned.
So Truth and Reconciliation Commissions are, in essence, sort of on a national level, what restorative justice is on an interpersonal level. It's really a kind of scale up of restorative justice, where you say a national crime has been committed, a national harm has been caused, a national trauma is sitting at the core of our nation or our community or our city, whatever it is. And how do we address that from a restorative perspective? So that means how do we acknowledge what has happened? How do we reckon with the evils and the traumas of what has happened? And then how do we determine a path forward that involves reparations and acts of reconciliation and acts of repair? And so naturally, I've always been interested in and always studied TRCs. There have been hundreds of them all over the world. The most famous of them took place in South Africa. I wrote about, it wasn't called a TRC, but I wrote about Rwanda's process post-genocide. I spent time in Chile looking at their TRC after the Pinochet regime. So this has been, ingrained in many national narratives. It has not been a part of the US national narrative. And early on, and so I thought about that quite a bit early on in the pandemic. I wrote a column about it for my Medium column, why the US needs a Truth and Reconciliation Commission more than ever, and why we also need, as part of that, need a new constitution to go with it, and we need a system of reparations. And I think when I used to say that, even 6 months ago, before, people would think that that was lunacy. And now, frankly, it's on the cover of the New York Times Arts section today. Probably people have seen it. It's from an entertainment and a national narrative perspective, but it's saying we need a big televised event of truth and reconciliation in the way that South Africa's was televised as well and became part of a national event. And so,
and South Africa, Chile, Rwanda, they went through this at a time before curated social media feeds that allow a ricochet within a contained bubble. Even as you made the comment about it's the cover of the New York Times, it triggered to me that would be proof to part of the country that it is lunacy, because it's on the cover of the New York Times. As important as that dialogue is, as that reckoning is, can you imagine it happening and working and succeeding in this crazy social media moment that grabs and twists everything?
It's a really hard question to answer, Tim, because it's hard to maintain optimism. I'll be real, as somebody who sees herself as driven by optimism. It is very difficult in these moments when we look at some of the things happening, being said by, you know, the person in our White House, by so many members of the U.S. That are so deeply troubling. And I think you're very right to point out that the social media piece of things is further polarizing and makes things further challenging. On the other hand, we don't have any choice. The onus is upon us to try. And I think that there can be outreach done to bring other sides of the equation. And I'm not talking about, you know, the far right fringe. Like, as part of any conversation, you have to determine what is the basic premise. You know, we have to agree on certain basic premises. And I don't think, you know, we're going to do outreach to the KKK to be a part of these dialogues. Like, we have to determine what those premises are. But I do think that there can be outreach done. I do think that social media is also, as much as it can be our enemy in terms of polarizing and in terms of lack of attention span for things and sort of lack of depth and sustained nuanced conversation, which is necessary for this kind of a thing, it can also be our friend in terms of getting the message out in ways that that are powerful and succinct and accessible. So we have no choice but to try. There's no chance. We need to recognize that this country is founded on traumas that have not been nationally recognized in any real way. And that's what all the, the work around statues and monuments is about too. We must reckon with our genocide of Native Americans, slavery as the capitalistic institution upon which the systems of structures of this nation were founded. We can't go forward until we reckon with that. And reckoning can't just be conversations. It needs to be a plan of action for what this looks like in terms of our school systems, in terms of our healthcare systems, our justice systems, all of them.
You made a reference that it's hard to be optimistic, but I'll observe in the preparation, Reg, you signed off of one of the emails with a phrase that I think both Reg and I really responded to, which was something like looking forward to building with you. And building with you seemed like such a hopeful, optimistic statement. I know I want to leave time with Reg and questions from the crowd, but as I think about building with you, it implies that you might have some advice or some homework for me or for the people who are listening. Do you have some instructions that we can use to build?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, I always think in terms of building rather than, tearing down. I think we need to be, that's the inherent optimist in me, but it's actually inspired by Angela Davis and her idea that where she cites W.E.B. Du Bois, the great scholar who talked about the fact that we need to not be focusing on ending slavery, but rather what are we building in its place? And that we're not only about ending mass incarceration and ending racism and ending, but we need to, build things and institutions and structures in a radically imaginative way. So I think number one is education. I mean, people are often, I've gotten a lot of, what can I do in this moment? You know, folks know that I've been doing this work for 2 decades. What can I do? What can I do? And I think sometimes, you know, it's not a moment to do, but it's a moment to learn. It's a moment to get educated and read and absorb. And I myself am doing more of this than ever before. And I'm a professor. You know, I've never exercised to more podcasts and webinars than I have in this moment. There is a lot out there and there's a lot to soak in, and you need to like properly give yourself time to do that. Read the books. And I don't have to, there are so many reading lists out now in terms of, you know, how to be an anti-racist and how to understand US history from an anti-racist perspective. So get educated, go to the webinars and, you know, listen to the podcasts and really understand things before just jumping into the fray. I think putting your money where your mouth is no small thing in this time. There are so many organizations, and not just the big ones, but the local community ones, the mutual aid groups that are springing up all over New York City. The different kinds of projects that are in development. I mean, I'm working on a bunch of them myself, whether it's Incarceration Nation's network projects about getting the word out on defund the prisons and how we can do this work differently and do it better. Whether it's, I mean, I'm working on a peacemaking academy at John Jay that I can talk to folks about, which is about training a radically different kind of person to do policing and to do parole and to do corrections. A person who comes from what we know as a credible messenger background, so is directly impacted and has experience and has like hands-on experience in social work and in law and in all kinds of other sorts of training. We don't have those kinds of training institutes currently. How can we build them? And I would love to be a part of the building of one at John Jay. That's my little, you know, throwing that in there. But no, I mean, there's so much that's coming out. So you don't have to only give to the big ones, but rather what's happening locally in your community. And then I think too, thinking about, I always say this in every talk I give, there's never a moment where I don't have a student who's in need, a prison to college pipeline student who's looking for work. So if you have a business, if you know people who have business, if you're hiring, pay attention to directly impacted folks and do the call out, whether it's through the public library program or the BARD program, through prison to college pipeline, through GOSO, all these organizations, there are networks of people. And I think now more than ever, I mean, you know, we're hopefully decarcerating on a level that is promising, but that is not going to lead us where we want it to lead us if we don't have strong reentry programs and reentry opportunities for people. So reentry is a more critical need than ever now. I mean, I also read today that New Jersey is pushing this release of 20% of its prison population. That's wonderful, but they're gonna need jobs and housing and support for trauma and you know, all kinds of other issues. So supporting reentry and through your own, and then lastly, just, you know, it's corny, but each one teach one. You know, what we're doing today, whatever your takeaways are from it, share with others, share on social media. I mean, we're on social, for better or for worse, we're on those platforms more than ever before. And it's not a moment to be afraid to use those platforms to speak out and to correct others. And you can correct others graciously. I correct others about their language all the time when I hear people talking about inmates and ex-cons and convicts and prisoners, things that are dehumanizing. You know, it's a very simple thing to say, you know what, it's not really nice to say that, and it's detrimental to the cause because it's dehumanizing. So I think we can do all of those things.
Well, you've helped me tremendously, so thank you. And just a shout out to the whole group, the Incarceration Nation Network website is really informative, and I found it really easy to spend time there and learn some things. Reg, I know that you were collecting questions from the audience. Shall I invite you back in to take over here? Oh, you're on mute.
All right, fine. Rookie. All right, yeah, let's, why don't we start with the Q&A? And I think the first question that came in is from a great guy from one of my old jobs, Larry Pollock. He says, is it fair to say that a restorative justice approach means that victimless crimes like illicit drug use and sales can no longer be crimes? And Baz, I think that's a really interesting question based on what you had said before on restorative justice. So let me take this.
Mm-hmm. So I think there's two ways to answer that. One is that there is a school of thought that says there's no such thing as a victimless crime. Because even if the example that was used, drug markets, even like if you're selling drugs to someone, there is the possibility of their overdosing, of their becoming addicted and becoming substance abusers in ways that ways that will damage not only their life, but their families' lives, their communities' lives. And more broadly speaking, that introducing drug markets into communities is often, though not necessarily so, tied to rise in violent crime, turf wars, other kinds of destructive elements. So one could argue that there is, that every act of every crime ultimately harms in some way. And that's also why I make that distinction between a crime and a harm, right? That we have to think about the idea of drug use. And this takes me to the second point around that question, that very good question, which is that we have criminalized drug use. And I can say that one of the agendas that we push at INN is the decriminalization of drugs, broadly speaking, and of taking a public health approach to drug use as opposed to a criminal justice approach, so that we are giving people who become unhealthy users of substances, whether it's cannabis, whether it's opioids, people who become unhealthy users of that are provided with assistance. And it's called the harm reduction model. And again, I'm simplifying, but the harm reduction model says we're never going to get people to quit using drugs entirely, just as we're never going to eliminate crime in the world entirely. But we can find ways to reduce the harm that is caused by excessively using these. So some of the models that we point to, and again, we have it on our website, incarcerationnationsnetwork.com. We've got a whole drug sort of feature where we talk about what smart on drugs looks like as opposed to the war on drugs. And Portugal is a model that comes to mind. Switzerland is a model that comes to mind in terms of drug use. We're also need to recognize that part of what we do all over the world in mass incarceration is criminalize poverty and criminalize things like criminalizing homelessness, criminalizing mental illness, and just, again, sicking the criminal justice system, whether it's police or prisons or both, usually, on scenarios that should involve social work, that should involve mental health provision and other kinds of things. And, again, this is a moment where we're, I think, starting to question that finally and recognizing that doesn't do any. I saw a headline today about Vancouver, quote, decriminalizing poverty. They're stopping to put police in scenarios that involve homelessness and thinking about how can we deploy well-trained social workers in that regard.
So Reg, if I can, because that just struck me, for much of this country, part of the national narrative is Horatio Alger, work hard, rise up, succeed. And when that's your national narrative, and if you truly believe that that's the story of the history of this country, it's hard not to staple it to, well, then someone who didn't succeed must not have followed that formula of work hard and try. And how do we escape a flawed national narrative that gets in the way of addressing things that, as you described them, it just seems so straightforward to me, but I can also picture people struggling with it. But I worked hard. Elon Musk sleeps at night in the factory to make things work. Why? He worked hard. How do we deal with that?
That is so important. I'm so glad you bring that up, Tim, because that is part of the national narrative that something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission would have to take on, is to expose that as the lie that it is. Now, I'm not saying there isn't such a thing as a work ethic, or, you know, that you can put in work and see results, and like we all know there is. But we talk about, you know, pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, and you don't recognize that in a legal context, we have made it so that certain classes and colors don't have bootstraps to begin with, right? That's when you see this lie exposed for what it is. And I think too, we need to recognize the racialization of this myth. Because it often gets tied to immigration. You know, certain immigrant groups will say, oh, but we came here with nothing but the shirt on our back, and then we were able to build ourselves into this. So just work hard and you shall be rewarded. No, 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 that's not how the narrative went. You came to this country, and certain immigrant groups, including my personal background as a Jewish person, you know, who is the granddaughter of immigrants who came here with nothing but a shirt on their backs and so on. But yeah, Jews were allowed into the circle of whiteness. So were Irish. And there are actually books, this isn't my theory, there's a book called How the Jews Became White, How the Irish Became White. The process of, you know, who gets allowed into the club of access, and by that means is allowed to buy housing in certain places where we could buy housing, where Black non-immigrants, but rather, you know, enslaved peoples were not allowed to buy housing. And so that's like one of, if not the most critical American dream myth that needs to be rewritten and re-examined. It's among the top 3 of those, and especially with regard to immigration.
Everything you say, Baz, is giving me the chills tonight. Everything. We got another question that came in from AF. I don't know who that is. Can a TRC work in our country with half the country sitting it out? Are there alternatives to a TRC that we can refer to from other countries that can yield some results with potentially a big chunk of our citizens thinking it's a fool's errand?
A great question that also requires a level of optimism. I mean, I will say that restorative justice cannot work if both parties are not, you know, in agreement on the process. So the short answer to that question is, if huge chunks of this country are sitting it out, then no, the process cannot be successful. So you have to have buy-in. Do you need to have full-on buy-in? I don't think so. And there is no rule around this. It's not sort of for me to say and designate this is okay, this isn't. But I think we'll need to determine what percentage we need in terms of buy-in in order to move forward. And I think, again, that involves determining certain premises that we have to share in order to have this conversation, and establishing those, almost like a new Declaration of Independence, in a sense. Like, here's what we believe to be fundamentally true about the United States of America and about our nation and what we want it to be.
All right. Well, listen, Tim, I know that you are I need to drop, and so I just want to. We're going to continue the conversation, everybody. So please don't drop immediately. But Tim, I just want to thank you so much. You have endured every mode that I have felt over the past 8 weeks with a tremendous amount of grace and forgiveness, and at the same time, never forgot a word that I've said and seem to have taken it to heart. And you're here, you know, helping to bring this kind of education to people that have the means to actually make a difference. And so thank you so much for doing this, really. And I couldn't appreciate your allyship more.
All the thanks is to you and to Baz, and I'm thrilled to help. My apologies that I need to run. Bye-bye.
Take care. All right, so we got a couple more questions coming in. Baz, are you okay for a couple more minutes?
Sure.
Okay. Let's take them in line. So this is a question from Matthew Bloom, who is my absolute, he's my go-to person for all things GOSO board related stuff. So he asks, how do we deal with the backlog of discrimination in housing and education?
Good question. And I'm glad you bring up the backlog. I mean, funding, you know, distribution, talking about defund the police, we need to distribute that money in housing, in education. We have radically defunded, you know, we've radically defunded education. We've radically defunded housing. We've radically defunded access to job opportunities for those cycling in and out of the criminal justice system. And so it all comes down to this rethinking of budgets. I mean, it's definitely one of the most exciting things happening right now is that, and I'm talking to predominantly, you know, finance people who understand budgets far better than I do. But up until this point, I don't think that most people out there have thought twice about the intricacies of their, you know, community budget and what gets spent on what, and how much is being spent on police and how little is being spent elsewhere and how that could be redistributed. So housing, education, it's all holistic. It's all part of the same process. And so folks should get involved in these budget conversations that are continuing to happen all over the country and frankly, the world.
That makes sense to me. Now, Baz, let me just follow up on that. So could you, are there any examples of other countries who have gone through a defunding of the police, kind of going from a punitive, more of a punitive model to less of a punitive model, for example?
I can think of one, and I was there last year. I don't know, time is a blur, but I was there sometime in the last, in pre-COVID days. Finland. Finland is a great example of a country that in its punitive model and its incarceration model was following the Russian model. It's sort of throughout Finnish history, it's been pulled between Sweden and Russia and very different approaches to everything. And in its approach to social services and in its punitive model of incarceration, it went the Russian route for many, many years, and up until the 1980s, when it decided we're gonna go the Swedish route in terms of, broadly speaking, our social services, which means greater availability and investment in social services and higher taxes to support them. And also in terms of radically decarcerating in the way that Sweden and the other Scandinavian countries do. And so they did so. They radically decarcerated. They convinced the public, even though it was against public opinion, which I deeply respect. They didn't just pander to what the public was screaming for, because often the public doesn't know. They're just screaming for punishment. They think it works. They think it makes people safer. It's not, you know, it's out of nothing more than that. But they did it, and they've been enormously successful, and they have some of the lowest recidivism rates in the world, some of the lowest, you know, crime rates, and incredible social services, to the point where I stayed in a hotel in Helsinki that was a former prison. They turned them into, you know, beautiful hotels, and it's one of the most notorious prisons in the country.
All right. Well, listen. One other follow up on this. I mean, so if everyone on the Zoom meeting is going to go and engage in budget talks about their school within their communities, to talk about how much is going to schools, where should be, you know, if we're taking money away from police, where should it go? What are like the line items? You know what I mean? Like when we say just invest in education, what kind of education would be like most specific to, I guess, reversing some of the damage that's already been done?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure I'd be best poised to get into the specifics of that per se, because also it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And I think there's lots of debates over, you know, some folks are, to me, it's like all the above. I mean, some people tend to emphasize, you know, pre-K education as being so critically important. But I think, you know, across the board, we need to do this. And that means to me, everything from pre-K to public universities, public education, period, and supporting that. Housing is massive. We do not, I mean, you know, we're in New York City. We do not have housing for people. We do not have adequate housing for people who are coming out of prison, who are facing mental illness. And so thinking, and NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority, is a mess, is severely underfunded and undersupported. And so, you know, without getting into like the specific, although because there's plenty online for people to go in, we know what needs to be funded, generally speaking.
And I can say, just from my experience working with the GOSO guys, I mean, it's just so true. How do you come out from incarceration and after undergoing all that trauma, being in some of like the nastiest places that you could imagine, they come out and they're supposed to just become productive members of society as if their dues have been paid fully from their prison sentence. But in fact, they come out traumatized, more distrustful of authority for good reason. They are categorically excluded from the workplace. They lose access to critical social services. And then we say go become productive members of society. And they don't even have a place to sleep. They have all their belongings in a bag that they sleep with or sleep like over.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think we're seeing it now. I live in Hell's Kitchen, and in my neighborhood, you know, there's a lot of hotels that have been transformed into, I don't even want to call them reentry, like they're just housing people who are who are coming out of the system, some of them in light of COVID. And I'm witnessing that there is little being done for these folks, right? I'm witnessing them just hanging out on the street corner all day long. And I'm thinking to myself, where are the social services? You know, where are the opportunities? Where is, you know, we can't just, you know, dump people into, okay, we've got a hotel that isn't being used, so we'll put a roof over their heads. That's not enough. That's not enough at all.
So I want to get to just a couple more questions that are coming up. Still on on education. So one question from Chris Lavoff, the father of my godson and a close friend of mine. What do you think would happen if donations to private schools were no longer tax deductible? Do you think that would help to actually allow for what effectively is like the tale of two education systems to have some convergence? Have you heard of anybody doing this to any success?
I haven't, but, and if I could be allowed to put my radical hat on for a minute.
Love it. Go for it. That's why we're here.
I mean, I don't really think we should have private education altogether. I think privatizing education is not the way to do it. I think we need to have real, strong education systems that are public. Again, when I think about some of the most functional places that I've been, whether it's Scandinavia, whether it's Rwanda, in the educational sector, I think about Singapore too. You know, we need to have it such that there isn't a need for that. And the idea of having two classes of education systems is like, it's deeply unsettling to me. Why should it be that some people, you know, who can afford to pay get this and those who can't afford to pay get this? Everything should be public, and governments should provide, and there's ways to do this successfully. There's certainly no shortage of strong public education system models around the world. They're not perfect, but they certainly exist. And I think that overall, my inclination is to say we need to make equal access to things, and that means strong public social services, which includes education. The other thing I'll say is that, again, you know, thinking radically and also thinking back, Reg, to your question about what level, you know, where in education specifically. I mean, I think if anything, you know, COVID has obviously upended our systems and structures, and education is now what everyone is talking about. Are we going back to school in the fall, and how can we do this safely and all that? But I also think it should be a moment, and I've heard conversations like this, but I'm not really seeing them go anywhere. It should be a moment where we just all together examine our curriculums and what we're teaching people and why we're doing it in this way in classrooms with lessons. Why does high school exist, right? What, in many ways, everything about the structure of high school is unsuited to the adolescent mind, spirit, and psychology, sitting in classrooms like this. I know that in New York, I don't know if it still exists, but there used to be City as School, which was like an entirely internship grounded program. Why are we not creating, like, you know, very different Not just, okay, let's add different things to their curriculum type of thing, but why are we sitting people in classrooms? Why aren't we doing everything on foot as a walking tour? Why are we saying, how about people go to school from age, 6 to 15, then they have internship years, then maybe they go back to college. There's a phrase, education is wasted, college is wasted on the young. That's, maybe it is, and maybe we don't need high school, and maybe we don't need algebra and all of that. I just think this is, if ever there were a moment to really start thinking about like square one in terms of what we do with education and everything else too, but I'm just thinking education in the immediate sense, this is that moment.
Well, first of all, I agree that is a very radical view in terms of the education, but at the end of the day, when you're talking about all this in the context of creating equal access, I think that's something that everyone would likely get behind. But I do suspect that there are a lot of people on the call right now who have their children in private schools who may have a different view, or say, okay, we should do that sometime in the future after my child graduates. But it's something that we all need to be thinking about, because this is a specific type of privilege that we at least need to acknowledge within our own families, within our own, for our own children. And that instinct to say, yeah, it's probably better for it to be equal access for everybody, but I want to have my child continue to have this benefit en masse when everyone's doing it, that results in the education systems that we have today.
I get that. And I just want to say, it's sort of akin to saying, like, if I live in a violence-ridden community and I live in a gated community, I understand that. Like, you want to be safe. Given the context of a dysfunctional system, you want to be sure that your child is getting educated in the best way possible. But I also think that doesn't preclude us from working toward a better world where I shouldn't have to live in that gated community.
Right.
But I understand that I'm going to live there if I'm vulnerable, right? So, but you can work towards another world where it isn't needed.
Right. I want to take a question that just came in. And Baz, you have 3 more minutes?
For you, absolutely.
I want to make sure we don't lose everybody for the recommendations talk, because I think there's a lot of heat behind it. But I want to go into this question that just came in. Elizabeth Brunna, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Why do taxpayers allow the Police Benevolent Association to defend police officers who act as predators on the poor and people of color? Why are their standards of accountability so different from those of teachers, doctors, social workers, and every other city, state employee? And so I don't know. This is a layup for you. What do you have to say about this?
Yeah, it's a great question that there's no short answer to that, but there is a lot of material on it. I think that, number one, police officers aren't the only ones who have a lot of power to act with impunity. So do prosecutors, for instance, who can prosecute away, send innocent people to jail and face impunity. So I think there's a lot of aspects of our sort of corrections officers. But I think the short answer is unions have enormous power. These are unions that have enormous power, enormous lobbying power, enormous political clout. The NYPD has a very ingrained relationship with our politicians, and the politicians are wary of stepping on the union's toes because they represent such strong political clout. They have such strong lobbying power. And so it's an unfortunate scenario when a union becomes part of the problem. But it is, and it creates a very us and them mentality and form of conversations. This is true about the corrections officers union as well, in ways that pain me, because I don't think to radically critique and say defund the police does not mean that we cannot engage with police people who are in the police force, engage with people who are corrections officers, and that there aren't tons of them who want to do their job in a way that we would admire. This is not about an individual attack on individual folks in those forces, but rather about the system and structure that does exactly that puts you above the law in ways that are, deeply, deeply traumatizing communities. But I would recommend reading, there's a ton out there now of reporting on the unions, both correctional unions, police unions, and exactly how they exert their power and their lobby and their influence.
And I want to ask you your final question, which is just tell us a little bit more about Incarceration Nation's network. Tell us why you think there's a need for such an organization, why you started it, what it's looking to accomplish.
So the network is, the short answer is there's really no other organization that's looking at this in a global context. And that is trying to think about this from a very solutions-oriented perspective in terms of transnational solidarity and crossing boundaries. And elevating the discourse and taking the discourse to new places. And so that means reaching an audience that maybe hasn't been touched by it in the US, but also reaching an audience that hasn't been touched by it in Kenya or Cambodia. And also being able to say in the US, hey, why don't we learn some lessons from innovative justice? I think, and again, this comes back to what we were all talking about in terms of building, that I'm very interested in talking about solutions and talking about what folks can support, and both support in terms of their personal emotional support, and also in terms of their money, where they can invest in. And so I wanted to create this kind of bridging the gap network that bridges the gap across national borders and boundaries, but also in terms of the kinds of people in this conversation. And so INN is about bringing together, everyone from the academic and the nonprofit practitioner and the directly impacted person to the artists and the filmmakers and the pop culture influencers, and like really bringing them all into the mix. And that is a product of, the fact that I'm a weird mix of things myself, but also that I think that when we really talk about narrative change and social fabric change, you can't do it alone in terms of one kind of person. It's got to be all of us in the mix. And so everything that we do is geared toward, from our website to the short documentary series we're working on, to our project, The Writing on the Wall, which is about elevating writing by people who are incarcerated as an art installation all over. We're now taking it on tour around the country. We're fundraising to take it around the world and, bring it into the heart of cities around the world. All of these projects are about connecting, I always say it's about connecting justice with imagination, that we need to think boldly, we need to think solutions oriented, and we need to elevate amazing work that's already happening. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. And a lot of this is not rocket science, it's really natural stuff, especially when it comes to reentry. And again, I know, you, Reg, and the GOSO folks, all of you who are knee deep in that, know that reentry isn't rocket science. The needs of people coming home, as you were laying them out, and the obstacles are like incredibly, in many ways, obvious. It's just about getting the word out there, getting the money to support these initiatives. So that's all of what INN does in collaboration with organizations doing the work.
Well, listen, I'll just say, I think that you are one of the most inspirational people that I've ever come across and to work with. You're just an outstanding partner, and I hope that people listen to every word you said. I think it's kind of hard not to. And
Thank you.
We'll listen. I'll also say this.
Those are your words, and I appreciate it. And I'm just glad that folks, came and joined this conversation. I'm really grateful that you set it up, because, both you and Tim, it's like a pleasure and an honor to reason with you both.
And I'll just say a plug to everybody. Check out the Incarceration Nation's network website. Take a look at Writing on the Wall as well. But these things that Baz is doing are just, it's incredible. And so, Baz, thank you so much. You're welcome to listen into the rest of this, and maybe I'll ask you to chime in if you do. But I want to move the next. I want to move to the next section of this talk. Thank you so much. Oh, and everybody, by the way, we're doing, Baz and Tim will be doing talks at GS in September, I believe, or October. So you'll see something. You'll see something on that. I guess whenever we're going to talk to GS people get to it.
Really looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Reg, and thanks to everybody. Have a great night.
Thanks. So what I would like to move to now is just, for those of you who are still on, so I'm looking at my wife and she's telling me to look at the screen. What I'd like to do from this point on, or the rest of the conversation, is to talk about the suggestions that I had laid out in the last talk, Black in America, and answer any questions that anybody has on it, or on that slate. And so just to reiterate what it is that I really believe needs to be considered and needs to be supported vocally from people, are big solutions. And so what I would suggest, number one, first and foremost, is I would ask everybody to think of the single biggest things that you can think of to directly address racial inequities in the companies you work for, in the schools that you're at, in the communities that you're in. When it comes to the companies that we work for, I think one thing that most of us have in common is that we're in corporate America. And I would just point out that in almost every aspect of our lives, we're talking about who makes decisions that reflect on us, who makes decisions that can make a difference in the world, who makes decisions that affect people we care about. What we do to engage those people and to have those people make decisions that we agree with, we tell them what we believe in, we tell them what we want to support, we let them know that we will vote them out if we don't like it. We let them know that we will support the hell out of them if they do the big things, the things that we want. And that dynamic doesn't always exist in corporate America. It's more of a structure where you come up with a big, people ask for big ideas, you give ideas in like a PowerPoint or, a discussion or whatever. And then the people who ask the question come back with what will be done without the full rationale, and you won't know kind of all the recommendations or all the things that were considered. And there's no way to really know if what's being done is at the scale that it ought to be done. And so starting with the question, why not, to every one of your big ideas should be the starting point. And I strongly encourage people to, build cohorts within your teams and come up with the biggest ideas within your teams, and sit down together and have a conversation about those ideas and say, why wouldn't we do this really big thing? And I think what you find is you find a bunch of, this isn't fair to these people if we move so quickly on this thing to help the Black employees that have not benefited the same as non-Black employees and have not moved up, and have not been recruited at the same pace. I would say if you don't have very big ideas, on your own, these are my 5. 1, set up for 18 months on a recurring basis, monthly racial equity podcast clubs within your teams, within your circles of friends, within your families. As Baz mentioned earlier, there are so many amazing podcasts and podcast episodes and books to leverage right now. And it's kind of hard to avoid them. And so I'd say, rather than having what can be pretty emotionally laborious conversations where Black people are sharing and crying, and most people on this phone have seen that from me, there are, I could say Oprah said some of the stuff that I said even better. And we can listen to the Oprah podcast and you can understand that perspective and we can have a conversation about it. And I think if senior leadership would commit to showing up, I think that the world would be a better place for it. I think that the Black people would feel very empowered to have really open conversations about race in which they are the experts in a lot of ways. And that's a total flip of the power dynamic in these conversations, where it's like you could be a junior associate and you're with a partner having a conversation about race and being Black in corporate America, and that white partner is not necessarily going to know that, they're not going to know what that experience is like. There are limits to empathy, and so I think it's also it's potentially a really empowering experience for people. So I say put it in calendars, recurring for 18 months. Explain that the reason it needs to be there for that long is because what we learned over the past 2 months is how little our non-Black allies have known about what it is like to work in corporate America, what it's like to be in America generally, but in corporate America in particular, how difficult it can be. And so that's number 1, and I'll move a little faster. Number 2 is to state that in 2022, this is for investment banks specifically, starting in 2022, we will not take a company public unless they have at least one Black member of their board of directors. We've done it already. Like, we've seen companies do this already, where they say you need at least one or two diverse board members. And we know that having diversity in senior ranks, the conversations change. That's my life. Like, for the past maybe 10 years of my career, I've been very much management aligned in my roles at Goldman Sachs. And when I'm in the room, there are certainly more considerations towards diversity. There's certainly some people make sure to mention it. And even that little thing makes a difference. The presence there makes a difference. And it also allows someone who's got a loud mouth like me, is the opportunity for me to say, wait a minute, what about this? Or what do you mean that person wasn't a good culture fit? You know, we can have these kinds of conversations, but they won't necessarily happen, and people won't even recognize that they ought to be happening if there isn't an adequate representation. That's what diversity and the part of the business case for diversity is all about. And so that if we could do that, and we can influence companies going public to ensure they have Black members of their board of directors, I think that what will end up happening is that there will be a race for Black talent in this country, and the companies will be better off and better informed and better prepared to operate in a world that will hopefully be more just and more equitable. And I think this would be a big part of it. Number three, I think that every business should think about how can we pro bonoize our business for small Black, our business and our expertise to the benefit of addressing racial equity in this country. So my view is we should have strategic advisory for racial equity in our investment bank and in every investment bank on the street. And it should be pro bono investment banking services for small Black owned businesses. It should be pro bono investment banking services and kind of matching services for not-for-profits whose missions are aligned with racial equity. And I have a lot more detail on that. I'm happy to answer any questions on the third one. But I strongly believe that we have a ton of expertise and a ton of talent, and a ton, as evidenced from the attendance in these calls, a ton of people who want to do something. And so I think that would really give people the opportunity to show their support in a meaningful way by getting involved with a racial equity project. Number four is, and I think this one I want to make the case pretty clearly. I think that we ought to be promoting just about every Black person who's eligible to be promoted. And I think, with few exceptions. The reason is, over the past 8 weeks, we have all listened to our Black colleagues, our Black friends, Black leaders, people on the news, people on TV, people on social media, sharing, crying, being extremely vulnerable for the benefit of us all, to explain that things were not as okay as you thought they were. And to me, in my experience and the experience of many Black people in corporate America, you walk into the building and the first thing you feel is like you're the other, and that you're representing the Black community. And that makes a difference. And then but there's so many more other examples, and I'll have another talk that'll be very specific to race in corporate America coming shortly. But here's the deal. If it takes, let's just say, 100 hypothetical performance points to make partner at an investment bank, I bet that there are a handful of Black managing directors who are registering at about an 80. And what I would say is, over the past 8 weeks, what everybody learned was how difficult it was. And what that really means is that there was not an inclusive environment. And I think we should just ask the question, who is responsible for creating an inclusive environment? Because it's been a failure, right? And I don't say that lightly, and I don't say that to point the finger. We have to acknowledge that simple truth. It has not been an inclusive environment, and it was so uninclusive that people didn't even know that it wasn't inclusive. That is what you have heard people talk about over the past 8 weeks. And so I would say that Black managing director isn't performing at an 80, right? That's what they're registering at with the current tools in place. but the current tools don't pick up the -50 headwind that the culture has been putting on. And it's not just the culture, it is hiring decisions, it is promotion decisions, it is informal relationships, it is access to good client opportunities, it is just general companionship with people around you. With being Black in America, there is always, just simply, you walk into the building and you're like, where am I? Why am I so underrepresented here? You know that something is off, because segregation ended a long time ago, supposedly. And so when you walk into these buildings, the first thing you're thinking about is like, something is off here. How do I have faith? Why should I have faith that my career is going to advance in the way that everyone else's career is going to advance? Because I don't see people above me. I barely see people below me. And so that suspicion is a real drain. This is what making an inclusive environment is all about. It is about having people feel that sense of belonging and that sense of comfort to walk in, to make a mistake, to take a risk. All of these things are, anyway. So when you're considering performance and you're considering promotions, at the end of the day, what you need to be thinking about is what happened if we actually live up to our own ideals and remove the headwinds from the Black employees that are registering at an 80. Maybe they end up with 130 performance points that go towards commerciality, towards innovation. And by the way, if what we are learning right now in this moment is that this country needs to be and will be in a better place, in a different place, more understanding place, starting very soon or now, why would we believe that the people who were making all of the decisions around recruiting, diversity, promotion, and building this inclusive environment, why do we think they're going to get it all right now? We need people in those positions. We need people of color in senior positions so that they can help us lead with what we now know to be what we now know to be the reality. We need to lead ourselves out of the failure of leadership that got us here. And so I strongly believe if we live up to our ideals, those Black employees are going to be giving a lot more than 100 performance points. And since there's no way to measure it, put faith in them now. Put faith in yourself, and like the organizations who are putting faith in themselves so that they can live up to their that they will live up to their ideals, and trust that when they do that, those Black employees are going to be firing on all pistons for potentially the first time. And so I strongly believe that we should be looking at promotions. And then the fifth thing is, I'd say, starting in 2022, from intern to lateral partner, have a target of 100% diversity in the Americas. Less, a target for white men that is equal to the highest percentage of Black employees that we've hired in a given class historically, so as not to be exclusionary. And then within the whole overall target, it'd be 75% Black. And I don't know how easy it would be to get there. My sense is that most organizations are not structured to find the Black talent, and that's what needs to change. And so I would say we have these very seemingly shockingly bold targets, but if you think about it and you put it into the perspective of where would that bring us relative to the communities that we operate in and the percentages of Blacks in those communities, I think that we're going to be woefully under even after 2 years. And I would just say all of these 5 suggestions, I put them through the formal channels within the business that I work, and we'll see how it goes. And I would say, if people, and my suggestion to everybody is, if you hear any of these ideas and you think that they have legs, you think that they are good ideas that like any firm should be considering, then find out who is making the proposals for your division or your business line, and let them know, each of you, let them know the big ideas that you support. Make it easy for them to propose the biggest things, because right now, I will tell you, I don't always believe that the people in these positions And this isn't necessarily about Goldman Sachs. I've been speaking to a lot of companies, a lot of employees at a lot of financial firms over the past couple of months, the past 2 months rather. And look, the senior people are more incentivized to get the quick wins than they are to try to propose something that's transformative because they don't think it'll get through. Let's give them some leeway. Let's give them a little bit of a tailwind to put it, or pressure, whatever you want to call it, to submit the bigger things. And so if anyone agrees or anyone believes in any of these 5 things that I just said, send them to the care team in the investment bank, or send them to Mina and others in CIMD, and find out who it is for your division and make your support known. It is not radical to let people know what you think is a good idea. It is not radical to expect an answer and know why it was or was not implemented. And so I want to pause there and see if there are any questions on any of these things, or if anyone wants to chime in with any ideas that you all have. Well, I'll start with one of the questions that I got over email before this call. People say, isn't it racist to reduce the target for white men in recruiting by so much? Isn't that exclusionary? Isn't that just like, 2 wrongs don't make a right? And I would say no. I would say to ask white men to defer coming to Goldman Sachs for 2 years is not too much to ask relative to how much hired, how many Black people got ground out through the process that wasn't working for them in the same way. All the applicants and all the interviewees who, were nixed because they just weren't the right fit. And compared to where we want to be, I think that there needs to be a transformative push that acknowledges that we are so far from where we ought to be, to have Black people in corporate America not so severely underrepresented that they need to be suspicious, and therefore they need to put energy into managing that suspicion so that they can get along with everybody and do their jobs. And that comes at a tremendous cost. It comes at a cost to those employees. It comes at a cost to the culture of the firm because they're not getting the best from people, and it comes at the cost of our clients. They're not getting the best of people. And if you are getting the best of any Black person, that best is still going to be limited by the fact some energy will always still need to go to questioning things. Because again, like I said in the last conversation, when my parents came to this country, I mean, it wasn't even, most people on the phone right now, their parents were alive when Black people couldn't really vote in this country. There's no reason for people not to be suspicious. I think it's actually, in many cases, it's a matter of survival. And so I do think, I don't think it's it would be any kind of racist or 2 wrongs don't make a right kind of situation. And I think the broader point here that I think people have been asking me about is like, what can I do? And like I said, I think that people should be, if you're on the line right now and you haven't just said, hey, I think this is a good idea, if you don't know who the decision makers are for how your company is going to react to this moment, that's step 1. Get to know who those people are. Step 2, tell them what you support. Ask them, are they considering this or that? Engage. And I think that is actually really, that is the opposite of what corporate American culture expects. And that's strange. And I don't even know why it would be that way. But people typically, the leadership makes decisions, and then we say, and it's framed in like the most glossy way. And it's usually, we're increasing from what we did in 2019 to now by X%. But, and it always sounds impressive until you kind of think about where we need to be, and then you realize doing that times 10 wouldn't get you close. And so I would just say the most important thing you can do is think big and understand what is really doable by your companies, And if you don't understand it, you should feel free to just put in ideas that are really, really big and let the companies figure out if they can work, and then find out what the reasons are and why they couldn't do it. And so with that, I'll open it up to any questions, and if there aren't any questions, we can end it here. All right, well, listen, as I said, there will be another conversation coming up shortly that will be focused exclusively on being Black in corporate America. And there may be a couple of other offshoots of that that you should look out for. If you have any ideas for other topics to cover in these talks, please let me know. You can email me. And I think a question just came in. I like all 5 of your big ideas, and we'll find out. That's not a question, man. But I appreciate you, and I think that's exactly right, Mr. AF. All right, listen, with that, thank you all so much for engaging. This is a big part and a big moment in the struggle for racial equity in this country and globally, and you all joining, getting educated, and acting is exactly what's needed. So I appreciate you all. Thank you very much.